This is Dr. Bafana with another lecture on Middle East politics. In today's lecture, we're going to talk about a very controversial topic within the region, something called structural adjustment. Now, if you don't know what that is coming into this lecture, you should look at what's happening with the US politics right now with the Trump administration and the large cuts that are being made to the government, to the public sector. This is an example of what happened as well in many Middle East countries throughout the 1970s, 80s, and 90s. Okay, so we're going to talk about what structural adjustment is in this lecture, why it led to a lot of political conflict and controversy, and why it emerged within certain Middle East countries during this time period. So let me just share my screen with you here. And of course, by the way, this is part of a lecture series, so I highly recommend that you watch some of the previous lectures on the Arab republics, particularly the lectures on military dictatorships and single party regimes. This will help you understand this lecture quite a bit. So, for this particular lecture, we have to do a few things. First, we have to define what exactly is a structural adjustment program and the Washington Consensus, right? So we're going to go into this. We're also going to discuss what the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank are in the process. And we're going to understand why various countries in the region, countries like Egypt, for example, Tunisia, Jordan, Morocco, engaged in these programs from the 70s to the 2000s. Okay, this is going to involve a shift in countries like Egypt from socialism to capitalism. So we're going to understand why this shift happened. And finally, we're going to understand the positives and negatives of these reforms. These reforms are part of a greater process called globalization. When the world began to open up to greater trade, when the United States became the world's prominent superpower in the process. So, of course, lots of controversies during this era, lots of positives and lots of negatives that we have to talk about. So, first things first, what exactly is a structural adjustment program? Well, to put it in the simplest terms possible, it involves something called liberalization of the economy. It's a shift from socialism to capitalism. Now, in a socialist economy, the state, the government, has a lot of control over the economy. Not only are they doing things like taxing and providing public services like roads and educational systems and healthcare, they're also involved with things like building factories and running businesses. They run the economy, the government. Whereas in contrast, capitalism involves a lot more freedom for private businesses, right? And it usually involves much lower taxes, much less involvement of the state within the private sector. And of course, the ideal with capitalism is that if you have free markets, ideally, that businesses will compete with each other, and this will lead to innovation. So, liberalization involves basically the a greater amount of freedom for businesses to operate, moving from socialism to capitalism, right? So, and it usually involves several different types of government reforms. For one, we see cuts to government spending, right? So you're not going to spend as much on education or healthcare or infrastructure. It usually involves as well cuts to welfare spending. So you're going to be spending less on redistributing wealth to the poor. And you're also as well going to have cuts to taxes, right? So you're not going to tax businesses as much. You're not going to tax citizens as much. This will give businesses more profit, in other words, more capital to reinvest. So it's a shift towards capitalism, these reforms. And much of it involves something called privatization. That's when we take state owned businesses, businesses controlled by the governments, and we turn them into private businesses owned by private citizens. So if you've got a factory that was built and run by the government, well, what happens is the state could then sell that factory off in an auction, right, to the highest bidder, ideally. And then it becomes a private business. So we call this privatization. Now, part of this as well involves liberalizing trade. Now, under socialist regimes, they usually keep their economies closed off from capitalist countries. They're usually not trading freely with other countries. The ideal behind this was to try to develop one's own domestic industries, okay? And the state would lead the way towards development. But in a shift to capitalism, what happens is the state begins allowing foreign companies to invest in the country, and it begins to open up to free trade. This might mean for example, reducing tariffs, that is taxes on imports, so that you allow other countries to trade with you. And it might mean as well, taking away things like subsidies for domestic businesses. So making it so that domestic businesses have to compete with foreign businesses. We call this the liberalization of international trade. And I think we could see here why capitalist countries like the United States would want poorer countries to do this, right? Because it would enable Western businesses to invest in other countries. And so what this does is it allows for foreign direct investment. So the ideal here is that if you open up your country to international trade, this will enable other countries to invest in your own. For a lot of poor countries during globalization, one of the big advantages they did have is that the cost of labor was cheaper. So they were hoping Western countries would establish factories. Now, these reforms during the 1970s to the 2000s in developing countries, poor countries, including many countries in the Arab world, were known as the Washington Consensus. Now, why is this the case? Well, during this era, during the Cold War, the United States was heavily promoting capitalism throughout the world. And during the 1970s and 80s, many developing countries were shifting away from the Soviet Union to the United States. And the United States wanted countries to make these type of reforms because this would enable the spread of capitalism and US influence throughout the globe. Now, during this era as well, you had a lot of poor countries like Egypt, Jordan, Morocco, Tunisia, that were suffering from a lot of economic problems. Egypt and Tunisia, in particular, particularly for a couple of decades, had experimented with socialism, and the policies had not panned out as planned, and they were growing heavily in debt. And so, thus, one of the ways to be able to get loans in foreign aid was to turn to the United States and its allies in Western Europe for aid. So, of course, though, if you wanted to get a loan from these countries or help, you had to play ball with them. You had to shift towards capitalism. Now, on top of that, the United States and Western countries supported these international institutions known as the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. These two banks were established by the United Nations after World War II in 1945. And they had a very specific purpose. They would give out loans to struggling countries to help them in the short term with emergencies and to help them in the long term with economic development. The International Monetary Fund gives out loans on an emergency basis. And the World Bank gives out long-term loans for things like development projects, such as if you want to build a dam or if you want to build an industrial park or build infrastructure. These banks can help you do that. But here's the thing, though. These banks are controlled by whoever invests money into them. And the United States is the largest shareholder in these banks. And because of this, they control who gets money and who does not. And in the 1970s and 80s, if you wanted to get a loan from the World Bank or the IMF, you had to engage in what was known as structural adjustment programs. So what an SMP is, if you want to get a loan from these banks, well, they would say, okay, but you have to make cuts to government spending, to taxes. You have to liberalize your trade if you want to get loans from us. And if the IMF gives you a loan, it's a sign that you shifted your country to capitalism. And thus, other countries would become more likely to give you aid, and private businesses would be more likely to invest in your borders. So, part of what really pushed a lot of these countries in the 70s and 80s in sub-Saharan Africa, the Middle East, the Latin America, towards the West and towards taking these loans was that there was growing debt in the developing world during this era. And so the idea was you would be relieved of your debt if you made these reforms. So that's what a structural adjustment program is. And many countries in the developing world did this. Okay, and I'm going to show you a list of these in a second in the Middle East. But this is just showing you on the map the countries that have taken out IMF loans during this time period. Now, notice most of the developing world, right? We have Latin America, Sub-Saharan Africa, the Middle East, Southeast Asia, Central Asia. So all throughout the globe, of course, the only countries that haven't really had to take out these loans are most of the world's wealthy, quote unquote, Western countries, right? Western and Central Europe, North America, Japan, they haven't had to take out these loans. Now, on top of that, in the Middle East, the countries that haven't had to take out these loans are the Arab Gulf countries. If you remember from last lecture, these countries have tiny populations, a lot of oil wealth, and a lot of social stability relative to other countries in the region. In contrast, other countries in the Middle East, the Arab republics, for example, like Egypt, Iraq, they suffered from a lot of problems related to experiments with socialism, problems related to internal conflicts, civil wars, international conflict with the Israeli state. And of course, a lot of these conflicts as well were driven by the Cold War politics of the United States and the Soviet Union. There were lots of military coups and instability in these countries. As the consequence, they grew badly into debt and thus they needed to be bailed out. So let me just show you really quickly just a list of the countries that received these loans. Hold on one second. Let's take a look here. Where is it? Here it is, list of structural adjustment programs. These are for our Arab countries. So we can see here Egypt, Jordan, Morocco, Tunisia, Algeria, Yemen, Lebanon, and Iraq are our Arab countries. Turkey as well, a Turkish country, also took out IMF loans. And notice how most of these are during kind of the same time period, right? 1970s to the 2000s, these loans. And on top of that, these are the countries that are not swimming in oil wealth like the Arab Gulf is, right? They tend to have larger populations. Most of them were the Arab republics. The only two exceptions are Jordan and Morocco. They're monarchies, but they're monarchies that are not wealthy in terms of having tons of oil wealth like the Arab Gulf countries are. So these countries all took out IMF loans, and the loans required the similar types of structural adjustments in these countries, shifts towards capitalism. All right, so let me go back here to my screen here. All right, so why did they decide to engage in these reforms? Well, a lot of it had to do with what happened in the preceding decades. From the 1950s to the 1970s, there was this failed economic experiment with socialist policies, okay, with authoritarian socialism. Single party states in the Arab world, like Egypt, Syria, Iraq, experimented with single party rule and socialist policies where the state would have tremendous control over the economy. Now, there was a failure to create economic growth. Now, part of the reason for this is that these states tried to industrialize. After having lived under long periods of European rule, these countries, after independence, tried to develop economically. They built steel factories, they built clothing factories, they tried to industrialize. But because there was a lack of economic competition in these societies, the quality of these public factories was poor. Because there was dictatorships in these countries, there was a lack of transparency and accountability. So the factories that built were really poor in quality. And so what happens is the factories these countries created, they failed to produce high quality goods. And I'll give you a wonderful example of this. The cars that were produced in Egypt under the Nasser regime in the late 50s and 60s were so poor in quality that they were often jokingly referred to by Egyptians as kofta cars. Kofta is this dessert that's very mushy. It's because these cars would, fall apart if they got into an accident, very unsafe. The quality was not very good. So as a result, they end up not creating high quality factories. And so what happens is the gross domestic product, the average salary of the average person stagnates in these countries. They didn't have the economic growth as expected. Now, on top of that, and this was another common problem in the communist bloc as well as these socialist countries in the Arab world, there was the underdevelopment of the agricultural sector. In the quest for economic development, there was such a heavy emphasis on cities and industry that they neglected the countryside and agricultural developments. They didn't invest much in, the new green technologies that were emerging in the West, in, combines, tractors, modern genetic technology that would lead to, better seeds and whatnot. This is something that wasn't invested in, right? So we get this underdevelopment of the agricultural sector, and thus these countries had to import a lot of food to feed their growing populations and their growing cities. Now, on top of that, because these socialist regimes guaranteed employment, guaranteed education, what's going to happen is that their factories are going to become bloated and overemployed with one too many workers, right? And you're going to end up having classrooms with one too many students. And it's just, you're going to have this bloated and inefficient public sector with lots of problems with corruption. And so overemployment is going to become a big problem here. Now, finally, these regimes, almost all of them except Tunisia, were founded, these single party socialist states, following military coups and periods of military rule. Militaries played a big role in these regimes, and they also fought in several critical wars with the Israeli state. And so they end up spending a lot on the military here, a lot of these governments. And so, because of this, they grow severely into debt and their economies stagnate in a big way. And let me just show you the economic evidence for this. Okay, so here we have our Western countries, which experienced a lot of economic growth. And, Japan's strategy for growth was to, emphasize its an export-oriented strategy to export goods to the West. Whereas these socialist economies like China, Egypt, and India, they closed off their economies from the West, and they engaged in these state-controlled sort of processes for industrialization where there was very little private sector operating. And as you can see, their economy stagnated from the 1950s to the 1970s. They did not grow much at all. So China, Egypt, and India, great examples. We see these same trends with countries that experimented with socialism in the region like Tunisia, Syria, Iraq. There was a lot of stagnation in terms of economic growth. It's really in the region of the Middle East, it's really mainly only those oil-based states that had economic growth. And it's not because they industrialized, it's because the price of oil skyrocketed after 1973. And here's what's interesting. While that spike in oil prices helped the Arab Gulf countries, and you can watch my previous lectures to learn more about that, it helped Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Bahrain, United Arab Emirates, Kuwait, and Oman. It did not help the countries of the Middle East that lacked oil resources. In fact, it severely hurt these countries because once the price of oil goes up, and if you don't have much in the way of oil, you are not going to be able to afford the cost of energy. The cost of energy is going to skyrocket. So it increased by 5 times the price of oil in the 1970s. We talked about the oil embargo in a previous lecture right after during the 1973 war between the Arab and Israeli states, when those monarchies in the Gulf temporarily stopped sending oil to Western countries. Well, what happened? The price of oil skyrocketed. And it also skyrocketed after the Iranian Revolution of 1979. So while oil prices would eventually come down in the 1980s a bit, at the end of the day, what happened is that the republics, as well as the monarchies without much oil, were hurt the worst. Okay, so republics without much oil include Egypt, Tunisia, Syria, Turkey, and Yemen, right? So Egypt, Tunisia, Syria, and Yemen are Arab republics, Arab speaking. Turkey, of course, a Turkish republic. These countries all had to, make cutbacks to state spending because of this. And 4 to 5 of them ended up going to the IMF to make structural adjustment programs, structural adjustment reforms. So Syria is the only one that did not do so. It stayed as a more closed off regime during this time period under the Assad family and Ba'ath rule. Now, monarchies without much oil, Morocco and Jordan, also engaged in these programs. They had to make a bunch of cutbacks during this era. Now, there are some Arab republics that do have a bunch of oil, but they also have very large populations. So, initially these countries were actually, they benefited during the 1970s, and they're going to see a spike in spending. So, Algeria and Iran are cases of this. However, when the price of oil then came back down in the 1980s, eventually these countries too are going to have to make reforms. So Algeria is going to engage in an S&P program in 1994. Now, in contrast, the Gulf monarchies had no structural adjustment programs. They did not make cuts at all to their spending in the way that those other countries did. In fact, during the oil boom, they're going to see an increase in spending. You're going to see a lot of guest workers, being brought into the country to help build up the economy. So we can see here once again the evidence for this. We have the price of crude oil went from about a little less than $20 a barrel to over $100 during the course of the 1970s. Now, as you can see, it did come back down during the 1980s, but then it spiked again in the 2000s. So lots of problems with energy affordability here for these Arab republics. Now, the last big factor here that's going to push these countries towards the West is the decline of the Soviet Union. These socialist single party states in the 50s and 60s were receiving a lot of help from the Soviet Union. We learned, for example, how Nasser got his dam built in Aswan in the south with the help of the communist bloc. However, if you know your basic history, communism in the Soviet Union declined from the 1970s to the 1990s. The Soviet Union would collapse by 1991. And so what's going to happen is these Arab republics are going to pretty much lose access to Soviet aid, both military and economic aid. And so, of course, who are they going to turn to? Well, they're going to turn to the world's remaining superpower, the United States and its Western allies. And so if you want help, you're going to have to turn to America. You're going to have to turn to the West and its financial institutions, the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. If you want financing, if you want arms. Now, of course, some of these countries did initially refuse. There's a lot of good reasons for not cutting state spending, right? You're going to lose a lot of your base of supports. These regimes had a lot of support from the poor masses as well as labor unions and cities because they were providing all these social welfare benefits. But by making cuts, right, you're going to lose a lot of your social base of support. And on top of that, a lot of the ideologies of these regimes, the reason for the existence of the single party regime depended on the fact that they, were providing these kind of socialist policies for people. So there's a lot of hesitancy. Okay. But at the end of the day, Western countries put a lot of pressure on these countries to make reforms. So, and of course, with growing debt, oftentimes they had no choice. And on top of that, America over time was getting more aggressive. As the Soviet Union declined, American power was growing, right? So especially after 1991. So for example, American influence, political influence on Iraq is going to grow. Initially, the Ba'ath regime in Iraq under Saddam Hussein, really avoided moving towards structural adjustment and had a lot of antagonisms with the West. However, that regime was overthrown by the United States in 2003. And just a year later, Iraq does a structural adjustment program under US occupation. So the United States as well played a big role in really pressuring countries to open up to capitalism in the region. And, just to show some evidence of this growing debt, take the case of Egypt. Notice how Egyptian debt started to spike by the 1970s. And as it lost access to Soviet aid, as it started to have problems in its economy, and as it had problems due to the wars of 1967 and 73 with Israel, suddenly Egypt needed a lot of help. And by the 70s, it was also importing a lot of its food, a lot of its grain as well from abroad. And so, thus, what starts to happen is these Arab republics, they start to open their economies. Now, in Arabic, we know this era as the infitah, the opening, the grand opening. Arab republics start to open up their economies to the West. And one of the big examples of this, and one of the first countries to do it was, of course, Egypt under Anwar Sadat. Now, his predecessor, Sadat, was a big Arab nationalist, a socialist, standing up to the West in Israel. Sadat, though, is going to shift course, especially after the 1973 war. He became president in 1970, and after that 73 war with Israel, he's going to shift towards liberalization. In 1974, he's going to start this process of opening the economy. And he called this process infitah. And he justified the shift to capitalism on the basis that socialism wasn't working and he needed to do something to kickstart the Egyptian economy. And so in 1976, he begins a structural adjustment program, opening up his economy to the rest of the world and to the United States in particular. And so part of this as well was a political shift, right? So in those years as well, he was negotiating with the Israelis, signing a peace agreement. And eventually in 1979, with the mediation of President Jimmy Carter, at the Camp David Accords, he signs a peace agreement with Israel and receives $2 billion in U.S. aid going forward after that. And so, of course, his successor, Hosni Mubarak, he became president after Sadat's assassination in 1981. He is going to continue this capitalist opening for the next 3 decades. He's going to continue the intifada. He's actually going to do another S&P program, which is going to be even a more radical shift to capitalism as even more state spending gets cut, as more privatization took place. And so what do these reforms involve? Well, there was cuts to welfare spending, cuts to jobs in the public sector, lowering of taxes for businessmen, and the opening of the economy, right? So they're going to liberalize trade. The private sector is going to grow as a consequence. Western companies are going to invest in Egypt. So you're going to get McDonald's, KFC. You're going to get all these different companies investing in the Egyptian economy. And on top of that as well, a lot of services, particularly for the middle and upper class, are going to get privatized. You're going to see the growth of private schools, hospitals, private charity networks to replace the diminished states. So they are going to try to mimic America's capitalist model here. And so what you see here is the growth of the private sector. And this is just some of the evidence from Egypt here. We can see here what happens. All right. We see employment in the public sector starts to decline. So this is the share of public sector employment. And then we see the employment in the private sector grows in relation to the public sector. Now, keep in mind, Egypt's population was growing at this time. So, we can see here it's staying flat, public sector employment, but that's actually an indication the state is shrinking because Egypt's population was growing greatly during this time. Egypt's population was only 10 million in 1900. By the time we get to the present day, it's going to be over 100 million. So the population skyrocketed, but the public sector employment did not grow. The private sector grew greatly during this era and is eventually going to become larger than the private sector by the 2000s. And as this privatization process picked up speed and grew, eventually foreigners are going to start to invest heavily in Egypt. We see a great growth in foreign direct investment. Now, notice here in the 60s and 70s, there was basically no private investment in Egypt from abroad. But starting in the 70s, it's going to start to grow. First, it's going to be slow, but by the 1990s and 2000s, it's really going to pick up, especially in the 2000s, at a time in which Hosni Mubarak's son, Gamal Mubarak, was really having a great influence on the economy. So it was really starting to open up during this era. And so here you can see an example of this. My Egyptian students, I taught in Egypt for many years. One of the things that they really loved was McDonald's. And you can see here McDonald's written in Arabic, a sign of Egypt's shift to capitalism. And of course, it wasn't just McDonald's, it's Microsoft, it's computers coming to Egypt. We see the introduction of a lot of Western technology coming into the country during this era, satellites, cell phones, and so on and so forth. Now, what were the outcomes of these S&Ps? And by the way, similar processes, they took place in Tunisia and elsewhere in the region, like Egypt. We see this shift towards privatization. Well, there were some positives that did come from it. So, for one, you do get a growth in foreign direct investment, right? We do see some Western companies moving in here. We do see some Western investment in Egyptian companies. And so there is increased economic growth. GDP, gross domestic product, does grow, as does per capita growth, right? So we do start to see economic growth in these countries. And of course, there is also greater consumption, particularly amongst the upper middle and upper classes. You're going to start to see the growth and access to foreign capital as well as technology. And on top of that, we're going to start to see the emergence of some new tourist sectors. They're going to grow greatly, tourism in particular. So on the Red Sea, for example, in Egypt, you're going to see a lot of hotels pop up on Tunisia's Mediterranean coastline. You're going to see in Turkey along its Mediterranean coast, a lot more tourism growing here. And you're also going to see a lot more commodity exports. So things like cotton, for example, minerals, oil in this region, you're going to start to see these things get exported more to the West as relations improve, trade agreements start to open up. So those are some of the positives. Now, what are the negatives? What are the problems? And there's a lot of problems during this era. Well, number one, by making those cuts to the welfare states, we're going to see the tremendous growth of income inequality in this region. We're going to see a lot of people fall into poverty, rise in unemployment rates. A lot of people are going to get left behind by these reforms. Now, the upper middle and upper classes are also going to benefit. We're going to see a new class of private businessmen emerge. Some people are going to grow very wealthy, but a lot more people are going to be left in poverty. We're going to see growing rates of inequality. We're also going to see as well problems created by this free trade. See, because now suddenly a lot of these public industries are going to be exposed to private competition, the industrial sector in these countries is going to decline, the domestic industrial sector. So we're going to see a decline in a lot of factories. So while we do see a lot of new businessmen running hotels and getting involved in, the emergence of this consumer industry, at the same time, we're going to see the decline of a lot of domestic factories and factory jobs. This is going to really hurt labor unions, for example. So we're going to see the decline of domestic industry here. And on top of that, there was also a problem with how these countries became capitalistic. What you're going to see happen is a lot of grand corruption emerge. Now, ideally, in a capitalist system, big businesses should not be supported unfairly by the states in a way that hurts competition, right? So the government shouldn't be supporting some businesses over others. And on top of that, when privatization is taking place, if the government is selling factories to the private sector or land to the private sector, they should do so in an open auction that's free and fair. They shouldn't be selling those public goods like public factories to businessmen, okay, for example, in a way that benefits crony capitalists. So, for example, you shouldn't sell a public factory to a private businessman for a price that's much less than it's worth in exchange for a bribe. Unfortunately, though, this is what usually happened in these Arab republics. It also happened in Russia, for example, when it began its privatization program in the 1990s. What you see emerge in these countries are these oligarchs, these very wealthy families, okay, with ties to the dictatorship. You begin to see a lot of these countries, they start to sell a lot of these public goods to family members and friends and people with connections to the regime in exchange for kickbacks. So we call this crony capitalism. You had a lot of these public industries sold cheaply to loyal businessmen in exchange for bribes. Now, why is this such a big problem? What is the issue with this? Well, it leads to something called graft. Okay, what happens is these businesses don't have to make much of the way in innovations in order to make a profit. They don't have to provide high quality products to make a profit because the state protects their businesses from real competition. Okay, so with crony capitalism, what ends up happening is the state protects some businesses and cracks down on others, leading to a situation where the businesses don't have to be very efficient to make a profit. And so this also as well creates a class of politically loyal crony businessmen with ties to the states. And thus there isn't real capitalism in these countries. Instead, what we have is crony capitalism. And even with those Western companies that come into these countries, they were usually a majority share in these companies were owned by these class of corrupt businessmen, okay, with ties to the state. And thus, you don't end up with real competition. And this grand corruption grows where members of the state end up receiving a lot of bribes from these politically loyal businessmen. And they end up growing incredibly wealthy. So, for example, the Mubarak family was incredibly corrupt, receiving a lot of bribes from these loyal cronyists in exchange for kickbacks. And on top of that, as well, because of the great cuts that were made to the public sector, to the bureaucracies, what's going to happen is we're going to see a rise in petty corruption. When you start to cut the salaries of police officers, of people who work for the public sector as teachers and other bureaucracies, they're going to start to become more likely to take bribes in exchange for services to make up for the cuts in their salaries. So teachers will start to take bribes in exchange for giving students good grades. People who work for, institutions that give out driver's license, they're going to start to take bribes in exchange for giving driver's licenses out. You're going to start to see the growth in petty corruption. If you want to get a service from the government, suddenly you have to pay bribes. Now, why is this such a big problem? Well, A, you're going to start to see, for example, a lot of people that shouldn't be receiving driver's licenses getting driver's licenses. And on top of that, you're going to start to see the issue of the fact that services are going to be more likely to be given to wealthy people, because if you can't afford a bribe, well, then you don't get that service from the public sector. And so we begin to see bureaucrats taking bribes in exchange for services. This is going to severely hurt the efficiency of these new bureaucracies. And so what happens here? Well, let me show you some evidence for this. Okay, so I'm not just making this stuff up here, right? So here in Egypt, we see a lot of economic growth from the 80s to the 2000s. So there's a lot of positives here, right? A lot more wealth comes into Egypt. The economy did grow, okay? And you see some manifestations of this. So we start to see a lot of these new tourist resorts. 10% of Egypt's economy becomes dependent on tourism, and they start building all these hotels on the Red Sea, right? This starts attracting more tourists from different parts of the globe. So we do get some positives. And in fact, even many upper middle class and upper class Egyptians, they start to go to these tourist resorts as well. Many of my students, right, they tended to be upper middle class. They tended to go with their families to the Red Sea on vacation quite often, right? It was a way to escape, the overcrowded, polluted conditions of Cairo, right? Take a break, go to the Red Sea. We also begin to see as well the middle and upper classes, they start to build these gated communities in the desert cities on the outskirts of the capital, Cairo. And so, for example, over 30 desert cities were built during the Sadat and Mubarak eras from the 1970s and the 2000s. There was a lot of foreign direct investment that went into these projects. And the hope was that you could build these new desert cities built on the American suburban model, that they would help improve the standard of living for Egyptians, that they would help improve the quality of life for people. And on top of that, they also established industrial parks. They established a lot of these new projects in the desert So the idea was you could relieve the overcrowding in the capital, Cairo, and improve the standard of living for people. So this was the ideal. Now, unfortunately, the reality was that most Egyptians did not benefit from this. Instead, over two-thirds of the people of Cairo are going to instead live in these informal communities. From the 1970s to the 2000s, informal communities grew on the outskirts of cities like Cairo, Damascus in Syria, in other parts of the Arab world. Once the state stopped building public sector housing and infrastructure, and as the private sector took over, well, this basically left it to the poor to build their own communities. It left it to the lower middle classes who couldn't afford to go out to those gated communities on the outskirts of Cairo to build their own communities on the outskirts of the city. And so what started to happen is you start to see the emergence of these informal communities, okay, that were built without the permission of the governments. And oftentimes what would happen is these poor or lower middle class families, they would buy a little bit of land on the outskirts of the city along the Nile River Valley. They would prop up these apartment buildings. And in order to get a local inspector or a police officer to look the other way, they might pay a small bribe. They would quickly build up these apartment complexes. Notice how they're all made of red mud bricks. These come from the mud of the Nile River Valley. Believe it or not, these buildings are more sturdy than they look. They didn't want them to collapse because their families were living in them, but they didn't finish the siding because you don't have to pay taxes in Egypt if you don't finish the siding. And so the Egyptian government as well, they never built formal roads in here, so they don't have good paved roads. They are overcrowded with a lot of smog and consumption. Now, initially, these communities initially didn't have access to good public transport, running water, but recently, due to the help of US aid, a metro line has been built in different parts of Cairo to help with transport. We've also seen as well some running water and electricity for much of these communities. So standard of living has improved a bit, but these are informal communities with a hell of a lot of problems. And it represents the vast inequality that exists within Egyptian society today. I actually did a lot of my studies in Egypt on these informal communities when I lived. And I think it's a great exemplification of the problems of the infitah, these structural adjustment programs. In fact, the Middle East is going to have the arguably the highest rate of inequality amongst any region in the world today. It has a lot of inequality within the region. So the Arab Gulf countries are much wealthier than the Arab republics. And on top of that, there's a lot of inequality within these countries that's been growing recently as well. So we're going to find out why this matters in a future lecture when we talk about the Arab Spring. So as a result of making these cuts, what you're going to start to see happen is that these regimes are going to lose a lot of the legitimacy. The single party states, these Arab republics, are going to start to witness social protests. There's going to be, for example, a lot of food riots in response to the cuts to bread subsidies and other welfare to the poor. Spontaneous protests are going to break out in a lot of cities throughout the Arab world in response to this. So Egypt had one in 1977. Morocco had food riots in 84 and 90. Tunisia in 84. Algeria in 1989. Jordan in 89 and 96. We're also going to see as well a lot of labor unions turn against these governments. Initially, the labor unions were the backbone of the single party states of the Arab nationalist regimes. But they're going to start to turn on these governments and they're going to start to engage in mass strikes and protests. So Egypt in 78, Morocco in 81, Egypt in the mid 1980s, all great examples of this. And wherever you find these structural adjustment programs, you will find mass protests often taking place by labor unions. And so as a consequence, the Arab republics are going to start to lose much of their legitimacy. Now, in the next lecture, I'm going to talk about the reforms that these governments are going to make. They're going to start to loosen control of society. And on top of that, because Arab nationalism, socialism lost so much of its legitimacy, other ideologies like Islamism and liberalism, that is support for an Islamic Sharia law, as well as support for democracy and liberalism, they are going to start to grow during the 70s, 80s, and 90s in these countries, and they're going to represent challenges to these regimes. Okay, so that does it for my lecture today. I hope you all enjoyed it. Have a great day, guys. I'll see you at the next lecture.